All right, get right to it.
Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Mike, for facilitating this. And I have a friend, Charles McNulty. He is the theater critic for the LA Times. And when he saw on Facebook that I was going to be here, he wrote to me, and he wrote on my page, he said, I consider this one of the best bookstores in the country. What an honor. And I agree with him. So I just wanted to mention that. That was great. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my book, just give you a kind of an overview. The novel follows the journey of 4 women, friends, who lean on each other through tough times as they navigate motherhood, divorce, the struggles attendant to baby boomers who came of age in the Vietnam era. Some of it is heartbreaking, and some of it is laugh out loud funny. So kind of like life. And I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from each. And the cover image it's of the dunes at Cape May, New Jersey. And the reason is that the book ends in Cape May, but in the middle of the book, the 4 main characters spend this incredible 2 weeks there with their children. And it's a watershed moment for them, those 2 weeks that they spend there. And later, one of them wonders why nobody thought to take a photograph on the last night of all 4 of them, their children safe and sound, their families intact. And that reminded me of a quote by the writer Ursula K. Le Guin, and I thought this was really telling. She said, the only thing that makes life possible is permanent, intolerable uncertainty, not knowing what comes next. I think that's probably true. If we knew, we probably wouldn't be able to go on. So none of these characters know what's going to happen to them, and you won't either until you read the book. So I'm going to start rereading a page I have from the opening, so you can see how the book opens, and it'll introduce you to one of the main characters, Alice. 1986. When her daughter Lily was only 3, Alice nearly lost her. They had just eaten Sunday dinner with her parents and were on their way home. Alice's Plymouth Valiant was on its last legs, but there were leftovers in the back seat and Elton John on the radio. Hold me closer, tiny dancer. Slowing down as she approached a red light, Alice glanced over just before her daughter was sucked into the gathering darkness, airborne for a moment, fingers gripping the door handle, then gone. How long it took to come to a complete stop was anyone's guess. Later, Alice remembered the car drifting listlessly, sluggish as sap oozing from a sugar maple. By the time Alice was out of the car, Lily was already running toward her. A teenage boy watched them from the sidewalk where he was eating a slice of pizza. She all right? Yes, Alice assured him after a brief examination that revealed nothing, not even a scratch. Lily looked up at her mother, eyes wide and blue as marbles. You're lucky there was no one behind you, he said, wiping his hands on his t-shirt. Alice lifted Lily into her arms. Yes, lucky. Some years later, when she read a story in Red Book about a woman whose toddler died after falling out of a car, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that life was a total crapshoot. I keep asking myself why my daughter lived and hers didn't, she told her friend Charlotte, who'd read the same story. And Charlotte had replied cryptically, the mystery of selection is tragic. Now it was happening again. That phrase, the mystery of selection is tragic, ran through Alice's head on a loop after the hospital called. There had been an accident. Lily had been thrown clear of her boyfriend Frankie's Ford Maverick and was in serious condition. Frankie had been driving, but Charlotte's daughter Fern may also have been in the car. There was some confusion about that. Alice's husband Bill had taken their son Noah to his first Phillies game and would not be back until late. So she left him a note. You're not going to find out what happened to Lily for quite a bit into the book, because then I take us all back to 1973 when these 4 friends meet. And it's Nina, Teresa, Alice, and Charlotte. And the way they meet is simple geography. They all end up at the same town in the same subdivision of houses called Canterbury Commons. All of the streets are named after characters in the Canterbury Tales. And they meet. Alice is new to town. She's the last one to come in, and she meets them at Bridge Club. So that's how she meets these friends, and they are kind of unlikely friends. They're all very different people. But, you know, it's funny, like when you're younger like that and you're thrown into these situations, it's like you meet friends at work or in college, and this was wives and mothers, housewives, basically. You make friends with people because you're there, and that's, so you're not trying to figure out if you should get along. You just all become friends, and that's what happens to them. Well, Nina, you find out in chapter 1, Nina had been married to her love of her life, and he went to Vietnam, and he was killed there. Before their daughter, he never even got to meet his daughter Grace. And she's now remarried to a wealthy attorney who's got a drinking problem. So you meet her, and I just want to read you because there's a lot of, this was way back then was the Vietnam era, so I'm going to read a little bit from, they elope to get married when he gets drafted. His number came up because he didn't have the money to pay for another semester of school and had to work for a while, and the number came up while he was not in school and he'd get drafted. I just want to read you a little bit of this, you get a feeling for it. Ethan withdrew enough money from his savings account so that they could have a honeymoon of sorts in Savannah before he had to report for 8 weeks of basic combat training. It took a whole day to get there, and the streets were choked with tourists, but they found a room at a hotel in the French Quarter where, as it turned out, Grace was conceived. A week later, Ethan reported to Fort Dix, where a barber shaved his head, all that feathery hair falling to the floor. They wrote to each other, sometimes twice a week, but his letters became less frequent after he was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for advanced infantry training. Then in December, he called to tell Nina that he got a 3-day pass and would be coming to see her before he shipped out. By then, she was far enough along that he could feel the baby kick if she placed his palm on her abdomen. There, each night in her childhood bed, they talked in hushed tones about the future. Ethan left for San Francisco on Christmas Eve. Strangers, seeing him in uniform, offered to buy him dinner, and he called Nina that evening like he promised. They talked until he ran out of change and had to say goodbye. The next morning, he boarded an Air Force C-135, which made an emergency landing on Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On a dirt pathway, Ethan saw a battered telephone booth. A makeshift sign read, "Call the States, $6.75 per minute." He emptied his pockets and phoned Nina, but no one answered. Eleanor, that's Nina's mother, Eleanor made a pork roast with sauerkraut for good luck on New Year's Eve, and they watched the ball drop in Times Square. At the stroke of midnight, Nina thought of Ethan, who was deep in the jungle in Southeast Asia, where it had been 1967 for 11 hours already. When Grace was born that March, Ethan was on a search and destroy mission in the Ayadrong Valley in the Central Highlands. It was weeks before he found out that he was a father, and he tucked the photo that Nina sent of Grace, her hands folded under one plump cheek, her hair soft as down, into the scapular he kept in the pocket of his fatigues so he wouldn't forget that he had something to live for. During a firefight, he triggered an S-mine with the toe of his boot. The infantry called it a bouncing Betty because it was programmed with a 4-second delay, so it would spray 360 steel balls or even pieces of scrap metal horizontally at a very high speed. Almost impossible to outrun, it maimed as many soldiers as it killed. The officers who delivered the news assured Nina that Ethan had died immediately, but she assumed that they told everyone the same story. By the time his last letter arrived, Ethan was already dead and buried, and he'd included a photograph. He's wearing a sun-bleached helmet with a leafy green camouflage pattern. "We call them steel pots because they're so damn heavy," he wrote. Nina thought he still looked like Ethan, same sweet smile, a bump on the bridge of his nose from a bad fall as a boy. But he'd written something on the helmet band, the way someone who's been kidnapped might scrawl the words, "Help me," on a dusty windshield. War is hell. Now, Teresa was a very devout Catholic, going to get married and be a virgin on her wedding day, and she wore her poor boyfriend down till he finally said, "All right, I'll marry you," and they got married like in 1966 or something like that. So they have 2 kids, and she's happy because he's handsome. He was the definition of tall, dark, and handsome. She can't believe she married him. He married her. So they have this marriage. She thinks everything's hunky-dory going along, and now they've got these 2 kids, and I think Tina's maybe 4, and Frankie's a little bit older, and she starts having this suspicion that he might be cheating on her. He owns a company called Carpet Warehouse. So I'm going to read. Wait a minute. I'll find that chapter. Where did it go? Okay. All right, I've lost my page. Oh, here we are. Okay. All 4 of them were watching Days of Our Lives in Teresa's remodeled family room. Fake wood paneling, orange shag carpet, and a Zenith Space Command color television against one wall. Cookie saw Frank come out of Fitness World with a girl last week, said Teresa during a commercial break. Charlotte was flipping through the pages of Ladies' Home Journal. She had been reading Can This Marriage Be Saved for years and was fascinated by the juicy details that real-life couples were willing to share about their marital issues. Maybe it's a coincidence, she said, marking her page. They could have just been leaving at the same time, and Cookie jumped to conclusions. Teresa shook her head, a firm no. She was sure about what she saw. Which was, she said they looked pretty lovey-dovey. So do we know who she is? Alice asked Alice, who had been trying to follow the conversation while stealing glances at the television to see if Mike was finally going to tell Margot that he knew she was dying. Cookie said she looked like one of the cashiers who works at Montgomery Ward. Well, that's insulting, said Alice, miffed enough for both of them. At least he could replace you with better material. Not helping, said Nina, and Alice pulled a face. Have you confronted Frank yet? Asked Charlotte. No. Why not? Ann Landers says not to ask questions if you don't want to know the answer. I'd want to know, Alice said. I can't get a divorce, said Teresa. I wouldn't be able to take the sacraments. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, said Nina diplomatically. Lots of couples work these things out. Charlotte, who had read a number of promising stories in Ladies' Home Journal, nodded enthusiastically. Alice turned off the television. No one was watching Days of Our Lives anyway, since a real-life soap opera was unfolding right here in Teresa's living room. I wish we'd never joined that stupid gym, said Teresa, pushing herself out of the lazy boy recliner and snapping at Tina, who was grinding Play-Doh into the carpet. I don't think Fitness World is the problem, said Alice. Frank could have met someone at Carpet Warehouse or Burger King. You said he eats there every day. Nina shot Alice a warning look, said Alice, who gathered up her things. Nina pulled Teresa into an awkward hug. Sorry I can't stay, but Grace has a piano lesson in an hour. Teresa had encouraged Grace to use the baby grand piano in her living room since no one else played it, and she had been upstairs all afternoon practicing Chopin's Fantasie Impromptu. It was a difficult piece, especially for a 10-year-old, but one that she was determined to master. Anyway, they leave. Now it's a week or so later, a couple weeks later. When Teresa didn't bring up the subject of Frank's infidelity again, they all assumed that things had gone back to normal. Then Charlotte and Alice ran into her in the parking lot at Fitness World that summer. Frank's cardinal red Pontiac GTO sat in the blistering sun with the top down. Reaching into a plastic shopping bag, Teresa removed a carton of Dannon strawberry yogurt and tore off the lid. Winding up for the pitch, she let it rip. When the gooey pink contacts hit the windshield, she did a little dance, the star quarterback in the end zone after a touchdown. What are you doing? Asked Alice, squinting against the glare. What does it look like I'm doing? Grabbing another container, she lobbed it into the front seat. Then another. Dannon again, this time with fruit on the bottom. The cartons whizzed past like grenades, exploding on impact. Looks like you're out of ammo, said Alice when Teresa fished around in the flimsy bag and came up empty. What's going on? Asked Charlotte. He's in there with her. Teresa cocked her head toward the massive concrete structure that Alice called Club Fed. He hardly ever takes a Saturday off, but he promised the kids we'd have a cookout this afternoon, and then he made up some excuse about having to be somewhere for a few hours, some problem at the warehouse. But I knew he was lying, so I followed him. Does this look like a warehouse to you? Kind of does, said Alice, just to lighten things up. A piece of banana clung momentarily to the rear-view mirror before sliding into the muck that was oozing onto the floor-mounted shifter. I saw them with my own eyes, said Teresa. She was wearing those tiny little shorts that barely covered her ass. He's not even trying to keep it a secret. Alice gave her a minute and then asked, and how is this helping? I thought I'd teach him a lesson. He wants to eat yogurt, let him eat it off the seats of his precious car. Teresa let the plastic bag flutter into the back seat and wiped her hands on her shorts. Alice peered into the GTO where clots of yogurt were starting to congeal in the bucket seats. I'd love to see the expression on Frank's face when he gets here, she said, eliciting a small smile from Teresa. When Frank came home that afternoon, he called Frankie outside. Teresa was dying to find out how he was handling the fact that someone had vandalized his car, but she was afraid to show her face for fear of tipping her hand. A few minutes later, when she heard someone come in through the front door and go upstairs, she assumed it was Frankie. But now he was calling to her from the hallway, breathless and excited. Dad gave me $5 to clean his car, he said. You should see it, Mom. Some nut smeared yogurt all over everything. Oh, no, said Teresa with fake concern, though she wondered what Frankie would think if he knew that his mother was the nut in question. And these friends, there's things that happen in this book that I'm not going to tell you because they're spoilers, but they end up going Teresa and Alice and Nina all end up leaving and moving out of town, and there's reasons. And when they leave, these friends become separated, and you know how that is. Sometimes you just lose touch with people. But back then, we had no cell phones or no email, nothing. You change your phone number, you never found anyone. And so they've been gone for a long time. But the other three women end up doing things with their lives that they probably would have never done had they not left there. They fulfilled some kind of destiny that they might not have had they just stayed there. But Charlotte never left this time. Now we're getting toward the end of the book, and Charlotte finds out she has Alzheimer's, and she decides she really wants to see her friends again. She wants to see them before it's too late, and she gets her daughter, finds them all on Facebook, and contacts them. And so I'm going to just read something. The night that they arrived, Charlotte didn't want to see them right away because she was having a bad day. But there's a lot of philosophy in this book about what happens to us after we die for a lot of reasons, and people thinking about these issues. But I'm going to read you a little bit about Charlotte. Sometimes Charlotte felt like she was disintegrating, the pounding surf carrying bits and pieces of her away now that the seawall was no longer able to resist the storm surge. There were days when she became so listless that she couldn't get out of bed, and others when she was lucid enough to know that her conscious tomorrows were numbered. It was during one of those moments that Charlotte began thinking about the women who knew her when she was young and full of life, and it seemed important that she see them again before her memory was erased like equations from the chalkboard in her organic chemistry class. Memory, Charlotte believed, defined us. But what happened when those memories ceased to exist? Did we simply cease to exist as well? Often when she was lying in bed at night, what Proust called remembrances of things past surfaced like bubbles in ginger ale before dissipating just as quickly. Her parents playing pinochle with another couple at the kitchen table on Saturdays. Games of hopscotch or Red Rover with the army of other children in the neighborhood. Watching her older brother Alex change the oil in his Ford F1 pickup. Determined not to be a pipe fitter like his father or work in the mines like his grandfathers, Alex joined the Air Force right out of high school, met his wife Ingrid when he was stationed in Germany, and never lived in Hazleton again. Meanwhile, Charlotte had stayed put, as immobile as a piece of coral, as fixed in place as an insect trapped in amber. Now that her own mortality was not just an abstract concept but a very real possibility, Charlotte found herself thinking a lot about life and death. The Buddhist concept of reincarnation made more sense to her than the catechism of her Catholic girlhood. All that talk of souls languishing in purgatory like drivers stuck in rush hour traffic. Physicists theorize that as you fell toward the center of a black hole where the mass is concentrated, your body would be stretched like a noodle and pulled apart before disintegrating into its fundamental particles, which would pass through the other side and join the primordial soup of a new beginning. She hadn't been to Mass since Kip's funeral, but she wanted very much to believe that there was something greater than us at play in the cosmos, even if it was just a field of energy that produced the particles whose masses and charges were precise enough to allow human life in the first place.
You're wrong.
Thank you. That gives you a hint.
So how did you develop your story, and where did you get the idea
I guess
from?
how I got the idea and how I developed my story. Well, there's things I had, I had been working on this other book for 10, 12 years, who knows, maybe 20 some years. I had rewritten it, couldn't get it right, and I was over at Monty's one day, and he said, why don't you put that book away for a while, and why don't you why don't you start something that you feel compelled to tell? Write a story you feel compelled to tell. And I had 3 really close friends, and they all lost children in adulthood, and it was terrible. And I watched what all of them went through, the grieving process, and how they tried to live with that. And I said they all belong to a club nobody wants to be a member of.
Yeah.
And anyway, I dedicated the book to their children, and there's a storyline in there that kind of addresses that, and I write about them in the acknowledgments. I talk about each of them, and sadly, 2 of them did not live to see this book get published. They died. One died of COVID, and the other one died of complications from pneumonia. So a few years ago. So they never got to read it, but I mentioned them in the book and we talk about their children. So that's, and basically, I mean, it's not my life. It's not anyone's life in particular, but I've lived a life, and I've had friends who have, and you know, things that you've lived inform situations and scenes in the book. And I made up these characters though, and they just took on a life of their own. They became so real. That never happened to me before. It was kind of amazing. But I was in the house during the pandemic and trapped in. I just wrote. That's all I did. I was in a zone. So that's how it turned out.
I have one more question and we'll turn to the audience. You seem to know a lot about the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what your background is of your knowledge.
Well, Mike wants to know, he said, it seems like I know a lot about the Vietnam War and what my background was. I've been fascinated with that for a very long time. Of course, I grew up in that era, but I went down to Washington, D.C. probably in 1982 or 3, and I met this bunch of soldiers. These guys were at the wall. This was after the wall went up.
Yeah.
Maybe it was 83 then, 84. And they had a big table there. They were going to stay at that wall, morning, noon, and night. Somebody was going to man it. They wanted to bring attention to POWs who hadn't been accounted for, and they wanted them brought home. And so they were there every day, and I got to know them really well, and I went there several times, and I wrote about these guys. I was working for a newspaper then. So the editor at the newspaper, they gave me a story. I was going to write a story about these guys, and I went down to the wall when they dedicated the 3 soldiers statue, and I went with all these vets from Pittsburgh where I was living. And this was before Platoon came out. It was 10 years after the war ended. It was 83. And Vietnam is still an ugly episode. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And these vets were all down there in disparate parts of uniforms, and they didn't know what was, they were trying to figure out what happened to us. And I remember this one guy come up to me, and he was wearing a shirt with a big red 1 on it. And I said, "Were you in the 1st Infantry?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, I was in college when you were over there, and I was against the war. And he goes, "I don't care, you're here now." It makes me cry even now. He just hugged me. And it was like all this healing going on there with people. Like, it was terrible. We were all caught up in this thing. Even if we thought we wanted to go, we didn't know what was going on. And that was amazing. So I wrote this story. My cousin went with me. She took incredible photos. Write the story, put it get it all ready for the magazine, and write about this group that's at the wall and all these guys. And that Friday, supposed to be in the Sunday magazine or the newspaper, that Friday the editor calls me from the magazine. He said, "I have bad news. We're not going to run this story on Sunday." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "I was overruled in a staff meeting this morning." I said, "Why not?" He goes, "Well," it was the executive editor. He said, we used to call her the Iron Lady. She said, "It makes you feel sorry for the veterans." I said, "And?" "Well, could you rewrite it? Maybe it's, maybe make it a little more objective." I said, "All I did is describe what I saw down there. Draw your own conclusions. If it made you feel sorry, well, then you should." I said, he goes, "Can you rewrite it?" I said, "No." I went down and took it back. And now this was typed, because we didn't even have computers, with his editor's marks on it in pencil. And I put it in a bag, a plastic bag, and I kept it all these years. Back in, I guess, 2018, they were going to have the 35th anniversary of the wall, down in D.C. I found these vets in Pittsburgh again. Some of them had died, but I found this group of them, and they said they were all going there. And they said, and I got a hold of Pittsburgh Magazine, and I said, "You guys are sponsored by WQED PBS. Ken Burns' documentary was going to be on about Vietnam." And I said, "I would like to go with these guys and write about them and write about what it's like for them all these years later." Because they had seats. This time they weren't shoved behind snow fencing and told to get out of the way. They had seats. They brought their children, their grandchildren. And I went with them, and I sat with them, and I interviewed people. And so I wrote this story for them. They printed it.
Yeah.
And it was a finals for a Golden Quill Award. It was about time. So, yeah.
Very nice. Does anybody have a question for Marianne about the book or her writing?
They probably already know.
I'll ask.
Yes.
How long did it take you?
To write-
What was the editing process?
To write this book?
Yeah.
Well, I probably wrote it in a year or so. I mean, I was just writing every day.
Right.
And then I finished it, and then I tried to get an agent, and nothing was happening. And I luckily, agents usually, they just blow you off, but you don't get a reason why. But I had, because of the writers' conference, there were authors I brought in sent me to their agent, and they were polite enough to write me a nice letter to tell me why they rejected me. And after I read like 3 or 4 of them, I realized, oh, they all have the same. I had originally started the book out with backstories of each of the main characters. You find out where they are in the 60s. You know, you get this backstory. They all thought it was a book about a bunch of women from the 70s who get divorced. So I said, no, that isn't what it's about. But I realized Sid Stiebel, Karen's husband, God rest his soul, that was a great teacher of the Writers' Conference, he used to say, you know, in the first chapter, you tell your reader what this book is about. Well, I basically told them the wrong thing. So I made them believe that's what it was about. So I thought, I have to redo this, restructure it. And I started restructuring it. And when I did, I decided to start with, just go to the middle of the book and start with Lily's accident instead of leading up to that, and then flash back and go back and forth. And that's how I started this. And then I have a good friend I went to grad school with, and she said to me, she said, well, I know who Alice and Nina and Teresa are. They all have stories. Like, she goes, but what about Charlotte? What's her deal? And I said, oh, well, she's their 4th friend, the 4th person that was at Bridge that they met, you know. And she said, yeah, but she needs a story, like something has to be good. She goes, why don't you give her a secret? And we were trying to think what a good secret could be, and it couldn't be stuff you've already read. And then I had this brainstorm, and I love it, and you'll find out at the end of the book, this quiet, silent, perfect person with a perfect life, when she asks them to come, she wants to unload herself before she dies of this secret. And you'll find out what it is. It's very touching, and they're there for her. So the restructuring was the key. And then I spent 4 months rewriting it again. Literally, Karen knows, because I'd send her stuff, and she said, no, you need a chapter. And I just honed it, and that's when it got really good. It was that last rewrite. Everything started to flow. I knew the story was there, but I refined things. And this book is not the book that it was when I was sending it out. So I was proud enough of this book to get it out there. Yes, Claire.
You rearranged the furniture.
Yes, that's exactly right. Claire knows, she takes writing classes. So anyway, I'm proud of this book, and that's it. That's all I got to say.
Nice, very nice.
Thank you.